For this particular discussion and video, I'm going to use a lot of historical maps that are from or were made in the particular era that I'm referring to. Sorry, these older maps are really dusty here. But this one here is from 1815. So this was made in 1815, the year before Indiana became a state. So here we can see Europe. It really speaks to how well these maps were made, the workmanship. These are very much pieces of art. But anyway, back to the discussion, Eastern Europe. And so we have Eastern Europe. We see this particular area in the last 200 years has had a lot of what we call devolution. Another thing to say is it's a shatter belt. What does devolution mean? Devolution, D-E-V-O-L-U-T-I-O-N, means essentially you have something that's broken up into smaller pieces. A shatter belt is essentially an area, a belt, a region in which the borders are constantly being redrawn. And in Eastern Europe, we've got devolution, and we've got a good example of a shatter belt. So we're going to, as we go through these different maps, kind of showcase in various examples countries and regions and empires and ruling and political entities breaking up into smaller pieces over time. Further, we look at Eastern Europe, and it's definitely a transitional area, not only from Western Europe to Russia, but also Western Europe to Asia, Western Europe to the Middle East, and so on. So it's definitely kind of this transitional area, and it's very important to keep in mind because it's always kind of at the burden of bigger, more powerful entities on both sides of Eastern Europe. And so oftentimes kind of get swallowed up by bigger forces, bigger powers that they're essentially stuck in the middle of. So once again, it's a key theme, get stuck in the head. So let's go and start talking about this map here. In the yellow area, we see the Empire of Austria. Essentially, we could think of it as the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which kind of claims this area of Austria-Hungary, which is today Austria-Hungary and Czech Republic. We also have the brown area to the north of that, which is Prussia, which is Poland, and parts of Germany, and parts of the Baltic states. And then we have over to the east, we have in kind of a green color Russia. So essentially, if you add into the south, the Ottoman Empire, Eastern Europe's had these four, in this particular time, 1815, has these four main entities that are kind of controlling the area. What's important to keep in mind, though, is that culturally, these groups are very different. So, for example, in the Empire of Austria, there you have more Protestants and Catholics there, along with the Germans. In Russia, you've got the Eastern Orthodox Christians. In the Ottoman Empire, you have Muslims, which is very important today. We're going to see Muslims in this particular part of Eastern Europe. Well, it kind of owes its legacy back to this particular time period. And so we had to keep this in mind. And of course, where you have these overlapping borders in these particular four entities, of course, you're going to often get some conflict. And that's definitely the case, as the Russians were fighting the Ottomans, the Prussians were fighting the Russians, the Austrians were fighting the Russians, and so on. But nonetheless, want to emphasize outside forces fighting, kind of conflict, bringing their issues to these particular places in Eastern Europe. Now we have the Bacon Standard Map of Europe from 1923. So you can see the technology is improved, the clarity of the map, the accuracy is much better. So it really showcases also the advancements in cartography. But this map, important to keep in mind, this is after World War I. And so World War I, things change. And so one of the key themes here is things constantly changing. So World War I, which happened between 1914 and 1918. But something to keep in mind, once again, in 20 years, this is all going to change again. So some things to keep in mind. So first, we no longer see the Ottoman Empire in this particular map. So beforehand, the Balkan Peninsula and down there in southeastern Europe, we saw the Ottoman Empire. Now it's no longer. So now we see Yugoslavia. So we have these new political entities, Bulgaria, Romania. And so once again, borders constantly changing, and bigger things, the Ottoman Empire breaking down into smaller things, these individual countries I just named. So essentially what happens, the Ottoman Empire, technologically, culturally, they were way behind. And so, you add into the fact that they also hitched their wagon to the Germans in World War I. So that's why the Ottoman Empire fell. But it's also one more reason why we look at this area, why Eastern Europe kind of lags behind Western Europe. Well, they were already kind of held back by that rule of the Ottoman Empire, which they weren't really the strongest of empires. Definitely not the most technologically advanced. Second, we have no longer the Austrian Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was another one that was a loser from World War I. Essentially, the empire broke up into Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia in this particular map. So we have, once again, new entities. One bigger thing, the Austrian Empire broken down into smaller pieces. Third, we got the Russians. The Russians are also kind of sort of losers from World War I, although they kind of got sucked into the conflict. But Russia, they retreated and essentially gave up some of their territory, especially there along the Baltic Sea. And they gave it up to the Germans. However, the Germans, they were also weakened from World War I. And so this then allowed an opportunity for the Polish to start claiming their area, but also Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And I mentioned them for a reason because we're going to come back to them. So Russia, as you can see here, Russian Socialist Federalists, whatever. So this is essentially Russia has now become the Soviet Union. So here we have, once again, the creation of a communist state. So one of the things is as they became a communist state, they started to say, we want some of our territory that we just gave back up. We gave up to the Germans. We want it back. So at the same time, you have the Germans and this guy named Adolf Hitler. I don't know if you know about him, but he wanted to expand as well into Eastern Europe. And so essentially, you had the Germans wanting to expand into Eastern Europe, and then the Russians also wanting to expand back into Eastern Europe. And the net result was they said, okay, let's just agree to not fight each other. So they signed a pact of non-aggression, the Soviets and the Germans. So essentially, World War II, the Soviets stayed out of things. But of course, the Nazis being Nazis, and Hitler being Hitler, they said, well, we're going to go ahead and invade you guys. So the Germans and the Nazis invaded the Soviets, and then the Soviets, once again, were brought into another conflict. So essentially, the Soviets attacked the Germans from the east, and the United States and the Allies attacked the Germans from the west. Would eventually lead to this map here that was made after World War II ended, 1945/1946 here in Europe after nearly 40 years of some serious major conflict in which Europe was beaten, battered, and bruised and needed to rebuild. And so here's the deal. They agreed as far as the rebuilding of Europe, the Allies, which was the United States, the British, the French, helped to rebuild a lot of the blue countries. And then the Soviets decided, okay, keep in mind, the Allies and Soviets were good friends at the time because they both helped eliminate the Germans. The Soviets said, okay, well, we're going to help rebuild a lot of those pink countries there in Eastern Europe. And so they both agreed, okay, here you have this beast that is Germany and Nazi Germany. How you try to quiet the beast, you split in two. And so then they split Germany into the western and eastern halves, which we see separated there by that black line. Same goes with Berlin, which is what the black dot means. It was also separated into two different halves. More specific to Eastern Europe, this meant that they were now under the influence of the communist Soviet Union, which adds another layer to this particular Eastern Europe area. And so we think about those preceding maps. We have all those different layers. Now we have another layer. Even further, we have another bigger entity that I guarantee you, as I'll showcase here, some maps to follow, will devolve or break up or shatter into smaller pieces. So what this also meant is now the Soviet Union has reclaimed some previously lost territory that I talked about in that earlier map, especially when we think about Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and parts of Poland and Ukraine were essentially swallowed back up and became parts of the Soviet Union. So, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, those Baltic states were very briefly independent states there between World War I and World War II. So this is something that the Soviets, they liked this kind of these buffer states, this buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. Why? They were sick and tired of Western Europeans coming over, wanting to invade them and thus bringing them into another major conflict. And so the idea of a buffer zone made a lot of sense there. We go down to the Balkans, which is that area shaded in green. They're kind of considered non-aligned. So this is maybe another example of a buffer zone, but as I'll showcase later on in the cultural and language sections, and as I already talked about in the physical geography, this is going to be a very difficult area to control because it's so splintered and fractured and diverse. but also so rugged. So it's probably green more just because screw it. Who wants to control that particular area? It's very, very difficult to do so. With the help of the communist Soviets in rebuilding Eastern Europe, they also helped these countries in terms of electing new leadership. And shockingly, sarcasm, the victors of the elections were communists. So essentially, the Soviets, who were helping rebuild, were also helping to create new leaders. And those leaders that they created were very sympathetic or very similar to the same causes, the same communist causes there in the Soviet Union. So essentially what happened was we started to see this development of this friction between Western Europe, those blue countries being more capitalist, versus the communist countries there on the pink, the right side of the black line. So you also have Scandinavian countries there, which were kind of capitalist, kind of socialist, but I'll get into that a little bit later. But wait a minute here. This makes it seem as if the United States and the Soviets were good friends with each other. And if we know anything, that's not the case. So what happened? What happened was the confrontation between communism and capitalism that ended up morphing into the Cold War, a conflict between capitalist Western democracies and the Eastern communist countries that continued until a very important year, continued until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And so what happened here was the Americans and their buddies, they weren't happy about the conversion of more and more territories to communism. So why wouldn't we go in there? Why wouldn't the Allies go in there and say, okay, communism is bad? Because essentially at the time, we just fought this war together. The Soviets and the Allies came together to end the conflict. They came together to fight off the common enemy, the Nazi Germans. So it was still in that grace period where it's kind of awkward, in which you're not going to suddenly attack someone in which you just became friends with and helped each other out. But eventually tensions would build, and the two main sides of this emerging conflict, essentially the tensions continued to bubble. So essentially what we had was this dark black line is what separated the two diametrically opposed groups. So that black line is called the Iron Curtain, a metaphor for this line that came from Winston Churchill, made a speech in 1946 in which he used the term to essentially say an iron curtain has descended across the continent, and on one side is the capitalist democratic countries of Western Europe, on the other side is the evil Soviet Union and their communist ways. So eventually the Cold War tension would manifest itself into these colors that we see in this map. The blue, NATO, which is a military alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Essentially, it's a supranationalist organization. It's a mutual defense clause in which if you invade any of us, we'll all invade you. And so in response to that was the Warsaw Pact, the pink countries which came together. So these pink countries came together and essentially was a mutual defense clause and says, okay, well, if you attack one of us, we'll come back and attack all of you. So now we'll go back to Eastern Europe. The sovereign, independent Eastern European countries that were under the influence of the Soviet Union became known as Soviet satellites. And so once again, they're heavily influenced by the Soviets. So this is going to include Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So these were, we're talking elections were rigged, people were, handpicked to lead countries. So this was a situation where, for 50 years, these Eastern European countries, although they might have been their own country, they might have been in the UN, they might have had, participated in UN meetings as their own country, but there's no doubt they were influenced, though, by the Soviets. Even further, if there was an uprising in one of these individual countries in which people said, no more of this, we want democracy, Soviet tanks would be there soon enough to wipe out that uprising. So once again, this was a relationship in which the Soviets definitely controlled a lot of these Eastern European countries. And so once again, we talked about the Ottoman Empire, how they kind of held back Eastern Europe. Well, also the Soviet and the communist era also held back Eastern Europe when we compare it to Western Europe, which was innovating technology. Japanese were innovating and trading ideas with the British, who were trading ideas with the Americans, and so on. So we had development of industry on one side of the Iron Curtain, and the other, it was definitely kind of very slow process of industrialization that held back Eastern Europe. But of course, the Eastern Europe map wasn't done changing. So here, this is a map of the Soviet Union in 1974 showing the 15 different republics, although I realize it's hard to see. In 1988, the Soviet Union started to collapse and had the signs a breakup was imminent. So you could kind of see that they were starting to have some tensions, and the Soviet Union, the idea of this communist state, was starting to fall apart. So seeing this happen in the Soviet Union, those Soviet satellites there in Eastern Europe said, hey, this is our time. We're kind of tired of this Soviet influence. They're starting to fall apart. Let's break up. So you started to see that. You started to see them, making their own decisions. So eventually, the first three countries to vote themselves off of the Soviet influence were Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, all of which we'll talk about a little bit later. Culturally, they're a little bit different than the Russians. They're Eastern, they're Western Slavs, where Russians are Eastern Slavs. I'll get more into that a little bit later. This, in turn, triggered the Soviet republics to say, hey, we want out too. We want to rule ourselves. And the first to do so were those three Baltic states I mentioned beforehand that were independent there for that small little time between World War I and World War II: Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Even further, the devolution fever, the shatter belt of this particular region, in that momentum, it kept going as the country of Yugoslavia was broken down, not so peacefully, into smaller pieces, as was the Czechoslovakia, which peacefully broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And then by 1991, the one Soviet Union was broken up into 15 independent pieces, independent states, and those were those former republics. So in sum, over the past 100 years, not a long time, the borders of Eastern Europe have constantly been changing, usually at the discretion of outsiders, and often at the detriment to the Eastern European people. But nonetheless, we can expect new countries to come out of Eastern Europe as we're going to get more devolution over time. This is a map of the European Union and all of its member states. Originally, the European Union, which was formed in 1993-ish, was mostly Western European countries, but over time, Eastern European countries have been added to the fold of EU countries. And so once again, the EU is a supranationalist organization with the idea of kind of creating a United States of Europe, kind of to create the similar characteristics that the United States has with all those individual states and those individual economies, helping to create a very robust, diverse one country. The idea here is these individual parts of Europe will together become one to kind of compete against the global economic superpower that is the United States. Who were the first three of the Eastern European countries, the countries on the right side or the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, to become EU? The first three were the same three that were first to vote themselves off the Soviet influence: Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. So they were so sick and tired of 50 years of Soviet rule that they wanted to make sure to join NATO, to make sure to join the EU, to make sure that ain't going to happen again. So this is where we're at the moment here in Eastern Europe. So a snapshot of what things are like today. So the recent Soviet influence is gone. No doubt it's still, you can still see the residue of that. You can still see the layers of that, or the legacies of that. And we see, Europe is on the trajectory to unification as the EU grows and more countries are being added over time. But when I was in school in 1980, I thought the Soviet Union was something that we were going to be talking about forever. And it's already no longer, and it's nothing like it used to be. And so we're seeing things change right before our eyes. And so who knows how this map will change in the next 10, 15, 20 years.